History is history, but what if I told you the most interesting parts of it never actually happened? Thanks for watching Informal History. My name's Adam. On this channel, we break down broad subjects so that everybody can understand and enjoy them. And today, we're going to talk about 5 things you probably think happened in history, but never actually did. So let's just start with a juicy one, the Salem witch trials. They did actually happen, but what if I told you nobody was ever burned at the stake? The Salem witch trials were a series of hearings and prosecutions of people accused of witchcraft between February 1692 and May 1693. Over 200 people were accused of witchcraft, most of them women, because as we all know, women are more sinful and something about damnation. I forget the exact quote. It was ridiculous, but mostly women were accused of witchcraft, although there were some men. And of those put to death, 14 were women, 5 were men. So that is a total of 19 people, and none of them were burned at all. They were all hanged. There was a 20th death, and this was a person who was crushed to death by stones. It was something that was supposed to be torture only, not an execution, but it turns out if you have lots of really heavy stones on your internal organs, they will pop and you will die. Now, where did this come from? In fact, there were witch trials in Europe, and those witches, sometimes were in fact burned at the stake. But either way, that is not something that was brought over to North America. The earliest record of witchcraft execution was that of Alcee Young in 1647 in Hartford, Connecticut, which was the start of the Connecticut witch trials, which lasted until 1663. Of course, not as much fun, the Connecticut witch trials, because Salem is Salem and everybody wants to go to Salem. There's cats and brooms and stuff. Coming in at number 4, Charles Lindbergh was not the first person to cross the Atlantic in a plane, but he was the first to do it by himself. In fact, Charles Lindbergh was the 67th person to cross the Atlantic in an aircraft. And the interesting thing about this whole phenomenon is you think now, air travel, everybody does it, it's really not that interesting, there's really nothing going on, nothing to speak about, because there are thousands and thousands of flights every single day, and almost none of them ever go down, maybe a handful a year. But in 1927, it was a really big deal to cross the Atlantic, not in a ship, but in a plane. This is the foresight to maybe there could be travelers crossing the Atlantic in a plane in the matter of hours, rather than taking days or weeks to do it on a ship. Now keep in mind, this was 33.5 hours it took Lindbergh to cross. Of course, he was in a plane like this, the Spirit of St. Louis, as opposed to a plane that we would fly in like this one, that can do it in 6 hours or something like that. But well before that, Captain John Alcock and Lieutenant Arthur Whitten Brown flew for 16 hours from St. John's, Newfoundland, all the way to Ireland. And this was in June of 1919. So this was only a few years after conventional flight was around. And the interesting thing was they shouldn't have even done it in the first place. These planes were not made to do this. Well, I mean, they were made to do this, but no rational person today would ever step foot on one of these things to skip across the pond like that. The takeoff was rushed, the runway wasn't long enough, and they barely made it over the trees, not to mention how heavy the thing was because of all the fuel. This was just a disaster waiting to happen, but they eventually did make it. Of course, they had to climb above the bad weather to the point where it was freezing conditions, and it started to freeze everything on the plane. Everything started to go wrong, exhaust almost falling off. They eventually descended, and then they realized, oh, we're over Ireland, we can land now. And then it was a very bumpy landing, but everybody survived. And that was the first trip across the Atlantic in an airplane. Keep in mind too, in these days, to try to keep awake for the very long flights that they were, the captains, so the pilots that shouldn't be consuming alcohol, were just downing whiskey and coffees to try to keep themselves awake. So obviously, aviation has come a long way, and I don't think you could do that today. And to quantify this, although 64 people did it before Lindbergh, most of them were passengers in an aircraft, so more or less a Zeppelin. So yeah, it's kind of a cop-out, but it's pretty impressive that he did it by himself, even if it did take him 33.5 hours. Coming in at number 3, during the 1929 stock market crash, there was a joke that people were lining up to find a window to jump out of. And everyone was talking about, and to this day still think, that people were just jumping out of windows on Wall Street when the stock market crashed. Brokers, people who lost everything in the crash, And it turns out nobody ever did that ever. In fact, the New York City's medical examiner made a point to say the next year after 1929, the suicide rate actually went down. And where did this come from? Well, Winston Churchill, Sir Winston Churchill, witnessed somebody fall from the 16th floor of the hotel that he was staying in. He attributed this to the stock market crash, when in fact it was a tourist who fell by accident. But the Will Rogers joke stands supreme, and to this day, a lot of people think people were lining up to find windows to jump out of from the 1929 stock market crash. That's not true at all. Number 2, Columbus didn't actually find America. In fact, he never even stepped foot on what we now know as America in terms of the country or even the great landmass that is North America. Christopher Columbus was not a really great guy, but he did a lot of really great things for navigation. And when he set out to find India, he was nowhere even close. He landed in the Caribbean. And really, as the story goes, he was trying to get to China from Europe, but either way, overshot it. And there's that whole thing about why Native Americans were called Indians because he thought he was in India. That's another thing for another day. Let me know in the comments section if you want me to tackle that one. Not only did he not find America because there were people here for way, way longer than he could ever have even imagined. He didn't realize that there was people here probably, but then he had no problem like enslaving them and torturing them and killing them. So he did find that there were people here, and he wasn't the one to discover the place. And as I said before, he didn't even really step foot on the US soil anyway. Well, what is now US, obviously. And to add insult to injury, it turns out that the 3 ships that were sent, they weren't even named what you think they were named. The Nina was just a nickname for a ship called the Santa Clara, and for the Pinta, it's a nickname in Spanish for prostitute. So, yeah. Everything you think about Columbus didn't actually happen, but happy Columbus Day in a few months. And number 1, the story of Thanksgiving. Now, as a Canadian, we do our Thanksgiving in October, but in November, a great tradition in the US, the last Thursday of the month. And as the story goes, the Pilgrims and the Natives came together for a harvest and peace and whatever, blah, blah, blah. None of that actually happened. The first Thanksgiving is set to be a joyous occasion where there was no turmoil and killing people, but in fact, it was a very violent affair, and there really was no first Thanksgiving. When the Pilgrims arrived in Plymouth in 1620, the inhabitants of the area had already experienced almost 100 years of negative conflict with Europeans, including slave raids and epidemics, and the truce that they made was short-lived and was the beginning of 50 years of abuse and exploitation by colonists. And all of this ended in a devastating war. So the feel-good story about Thanksgiving is really interesting to talk about and makes you feel good, but it turns out none of that was really true in the first place, and if you were a Native American in the 1600s, when the Europeans showed up, it was just a really bad time for you, more or less. Death and destruction. So there you go, the informal history of 5 things that never actually happened. Let me know in the comments section below your favorite thing that never actually happened but people think did. I could make a part 2 to this video if you want. Please do hit the like and subscribe button, helps the channel grow, and because I do videos every weekend, that means I'll see you in the next one.